Hello and welcome to the topic Classifying Living Things. In this lesson, we're going to talk about what are cells made of. Now in this lesson, we're going to learn two things. One, what is a cell made of? And two, how do the parts of a cell enable it to survive? So as always, let's start out with some vocabulary. The first word is prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cell is a cell that does not have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. See a diagram over there, and we'll talk further about it in the lesson. You also have eukaryotic cells. A eukaryotic cell is a cell that does have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. You then have cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the liquid part of a cell inside the cell membrane, and it contains things like salts and other molecules, etc. You also have mitochondrion. Mitochondrion is an organism that breaks down food and releases energy inside the cell. So it's an organelle inside the cell. So let's go ahead and begin our lesson now that we've done our vocabulary words. Now remember that all living things have cells, and the cells are the basic unit of an organism. All right? And we typically use microscopes to view cells because they're so small we can't see them with our eyes. Now, cells are made up of four types of what we call macromolecules. And those four types of macromolecules are nucleic acid, lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Again, macromolecules are nucleic acid, lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Now, cells are also surrounded by a cell membrane, and this keeps everything inside the cell. It also protects the cell from anything harmful. So it's kind of like, the cell membrane is kind of like the cell's skin. So, our first key concept check, what are cells made of? All right, well, cells are made up of macromolecules, and there are four types: nucleic, lipid, protein, and carbohydrate. So let's look at the types of cells. And we talked about this in our vocabulary words. And the first one was prokaryotic. You can see it, a little diagram of a prokaryotic cell here. And it kind of lists out some of the membranes or parts of it, like the cilia, the membrane, the DNA, the ribosomes, etc. And remember, it does not have organelles. So it just has parts of the cell. Now, the other one is eukaryotic cells. Now, eukaryotic cells do have organelles, such as the mitochondrion, the cytoplasm, the Golgi apparatus, etc. So it has all these little organelles and a nucleus inside. So there's your nucleus. All right, so that's the basic difference between a eukaryotic and prokaryotic, and we'll go over that a little bit more. Now, the cell membrane is made up of lipids and proteins. Lipids protect the inside of the cell from the external environment. So the lipids kind of keep the bad things out from the cell. Proteins and lipids in the cell membrane also will transport substances from inside the cell to outside the cell. So it helps it to go from inside the cell to outside the cell. It has a transport system that does that for it. So some cells also have cell walls. And basically, a cell wall is kind of like a cell membrane, but it is a strong, rigid layer outside of the membrane. All right? Typically found on plant cells. So you will have the cell wall outside of the cell membrane. So you can see here's the membrane on the inside, which is this part. And then the cell wall kind of wraps around it to protect it. And it's much more rigid. That means like hard. It doesn't bend as much. Now, the inside of a cell is mainly water. So that's what mainly makes up our cells. Now, this makes it easier for things to kind of move around, and it also gives cells their shape, all right? And then it helps to keep all the substances or the structures organized inside the cell. So it kind of floats in this liquid. Now, the liquid part of the cell inside the cell membrane is the cytoplasm. All right? So that cytoplasm is that kind of liquid part where everything is floating, and it's mostly water. The information that controls all the cell's activities, in other words, it tells the cell what should you do. It's all inside its genetic material. And we all know genetic material is DNA. Now, the DNA then gets transferred to the RNA, which is another nucleic acid, and it gives the cells instructions on what proteins it should be making. So the DNA is like the brain, and then it transfers it to the RNA, which then starts to give out instructions. So let's talk about what's inside the cell. Inside the cell are organelles, and the first one is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is what breaks down the food and then releases the energy inside the cell. You also have in plant cells something called chloroplasts, and we all know chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are basically what capture the light energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy for the plant. And we call that process photosynthesis. Now, proteins are made on the surface of something called ribosomes. And they make the proteins, and these ribosomes are in the cytoplasm, and they're in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. You also have an organelle called the Golgi apparatus. Now, the Golgi apparatus packages proteins into these little tiny organelles called vesicles. All right? So it basically takes all the protein and packs them in, like putting them in a bag. So it puts them in these little tiny organisms called vesicles. All right? So there's one that's just being formed, and there's one that's been released. All right? And these are incoming proteins. So that's what the Golgi does. Now, other molecules are stored in organelles called vacuoles. Vacuoles are basically a storage area within the cell. So your other key concept question is, how do parts of a cell enable it to survive? There are three things. The DNA contains the information that basically controls the cell. The RNA gives cells instructions. All right? And the mitochondria breaks down food and releases energy. So the DNA contains the information, the RNA gives cells instructions, and the mitochondria breaks down food and releases energy. So those three things are what help a cell survive. So in summary, prokaryotic cells are surrounded by a cell membrane, but they do not have organelles. Those are inside of a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cell has a nucleus and organelles. Now, plant cells have something called cell walls, and they also have chloroplasts, very large vacuoles. So there's your lesson on what are cells made of. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next lesson.